Star Wars used to be one of the most respected and beloved franchises on Earth. But now, public opinion seems to have shifted, and I want to figure out why. Were the sequel movies really that much worse than the first 6? Did they really ruin the franchise, or is the hate overblown, as it often is? To figure this out, I did what any normal person would do. Watched all 11 live-action Star Wars movies over the course of a weekend and ranked them on a scale from S to F. I feel like each tier is pretty self-explanatory, so let's just get into it. First up is The Phantom Menace. Every child has a movie that they're obsessed with that they force their parents to watch with them over and over again. This was my movie, and let me tell you, I think I owe them an apology. The Phantom Menace is not good. All the prequel movies have a special place in my heart because it is the trilogy I grew up with, but even I can put that aside to acknowledge and talk about their flaws. I know it's kind of tired to hate on Phantom Menace at this point, but I'm sorry, I just have to be honest. It is riddled with issues from the very first scene. One of the major issues with The Phantom Menace is simply the construction of the plot. Don't get me wrong, it's not the plot itself that's the issue, but the execution of the ideas. I'm not opposed to a trade war being the motivating factor behind a conflict. It's Star Wars. There's always going to be some political inclination. The issue is it feels like we're thrown into this conflict with very little explanation of why this trade dispute is happening in the first place. Who is the Trade Federation? Why are they blockading Naboo specifically? What does Naboo even export besides politicians and apparently spice from some moon? We're kind of just thrown into the action with very little information. And while I don't mind being thrown into the action in most cases, I feel like these questions were never really answered in this movie. And as the movie progressed, more and more questions got added to that unanswered pile. The Phantom Menace is supposed to be our introduction to the Republic era of Star Wars, and yet very few functions of the Republic are actually explained to us. And because the pacing is fairly brisk, it is hard to absorb all the secondary information given to us through dialogue, making it difficult to follow what's going on besides the surface level plot, which, by the way, isn't much better. Half the significant plot points that happen in this movie happen by accident or as a complete coincidence, like how Qui-Gon and his party just so happened to stop on Tatooine, which is exactly where the Chosen One happens to be, or how the Jedi are able to find Padme's party as they're being transported outside, or how Anakin launches his spaceship completely by accident and then pilots it well enough to escape the ship he blew up. Some of these conveniences and coincidences can be chalked up to the Force, but there are so many that I don't think using that as an excuse for all of them is a good idea, as it makes the story look even more poorly constructed. The plot just progresses in a hard-to-follow, unbelievable, and almost comically bad manner. Another large problem area for me was the dialogue. There were just so many moments that felt clunky and unnatural, and while a lot of them have become iconic lines for Star Wars fans, a big part of why they became iconic is because they were bad. The most egregious example of poor scripting, though, isn't one specific line, rather the lack thereof, because in this movie, we do not hear Qui-Gon's name for almost 40 minutes. Almost a third of the movie passes without us knowing the name of the main character. This isn't a huge deal for veteran Star Wars fans who are rewatching the movie, but if a new fan watches this movie for the first time without watching any trailers or doing background research, it will take them almost 40 minutes to learn one of the main characters' names. That's just crazy to me, especially since we learned the names of all the other major characters on their introduction. Like, how do you miss that? Then there is, of course, the elephant in the room, or I guess the weird frog thing. Jar Jar Binks. I know it's been said 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways, but this dude is just so annoying in every scene he's in. I can accept a comic relief character coming off as annoying every once in a while, but literally every single thing he does is just annoying. He also, no offense, doesn't look that good. In fact, almost all the CGI in this movie has aged pretty terribly. Really, the only CGI aspect that I think looks decent by today's standards are some of the spacecraft and ships in general, but the droids, the Gungans, and the cities of Coruscant, they all look like they come from a PS3 game, if not worse. Now, I don't want to take this aged CGI into account too much when rating this movie. It doesn't really impact the plot or the movie as a whole in terms of construction or quality. but it is really distracting to see a random low-fidelity alien in the background of an otherwise well-done scene, so I felt the need to mention it. Now, I know I've been pretty harsh on this movie so far, but it wasn't all bad. There were a number of things I really liked about it. One outstanding aspect for me, right off the bat, was the new environments we were introduced to. Naboo is such a pretty and idyllic planet. Between the natural Windows XP backgrounds and the awesome architectural stylings of the cities, it's really beautiful. Even the Gungan city looks really cool, and to this day, it's low-key one of my favorite Star Wars environments from a visual standpoint. Coruscant is a really cool idea for a city as well, and the interiors and the way the city functions is really sick too. Another aspect that really stuck out to me in a positive manner was, of course, the choreography. We all saw this one coming, right? The whole prequel trilogy really ups the ante when it comes to lightsaber fights, and if I was judging each trilogy just by the quality of these battles, the prequels would be in first by a pretty wide margin, and no battle demonstrates this better than Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan versus Darth Maul. In terms of choreography, this fight is easily top 2 in the series, and even the little mini fight they had on Tatooine was well done too, which is crazy because it was like 30 seconds long. I also really enjoyed the introductions of C-3PO and the GOAT R2-D2. I can't even lie, R2 is low-key my favorite Star Wars character, which might sound psychotic to say, but he just adds so much to every scene he's in, and he's so expressive and sassy for a character that can't even speak. Both these droids are really enjoyable in pretty much every movie they're in, so they're of course a high point for this movie as well. Another obvious good part of this movie was, of course, the soundtrack. When you've got John Williams on the beat, you will pretty much never have a bad soundtrack, and he really knocked it out of the park for this movie. Duel of the Fates is one of the most iconic pieces of film score ever written, and the fact it was written for such an otherwise mid-movie is so funny to me. Also, unlike a lot of people, I actually enjoyed the Space Senate stuff. I found it really interesting to watch how this democracy functions when compared to our own, and I thought it added a decent amount of world building through secondary narration. So if you can look past the plot issues, the character issues, the poorly aged visuals, the weird pacing, and the poorly done humor, you actually have a pretty decent movie. But obviously, the good does not outweigh the bad in this situation. As much as I would love to place one of my favorite childhood movies high up, I just can't. I'm gonna have to put it in D tier. I'm not putting it in F tier though. There's only one movie in the entire anthology that I think is worthy of the F tier, because it is just so much worse than anything else in the series. But it's not Attack of the Clones, so we're not talking about it now. Compared to The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones is without a doubt a notable step up in quality. Is it a good movie? Not really. It is still riddled with issues, like the entire romance plotline. I know they had to put this plotline in the movie, so I'm not upset that it's there, but man, the execution is not it. The pacing feels super weird. One scene, Padme is in staunch opposition to being with Anakin, then 2 seconds later, they're snogging out. What a crazy turnaround. I understand why it happened because the movie cannot be like 4 hours long, but I think they could have spent a little bit more time developing their relationship rather than going 0 to 100 like that. There's also Anakin's behavior towards Padme, which at times feels low-key creepy. He's so pushy and so incessant that sometimes it was just outright uncomfortable to watch. And the acting for Anakin is another major pain point for this movie. I don't want to be too harsh here because Hayden Christensen has already gotten enough hate for this role, but it is a very significant part of this movie, and as such, I feel as though I need to talk about it. His acting is hit or miss at best. There are tons of scenes where his acting feels one-dimensional and oftentimes outright awkward, but I didn't always hate the awkwardness. In some cases, the awkwardness actually felt pretty natural, considering Anakin was meeting a woman he had a crush on and hadn't seen in like 10 years. He's literally a 20-year-old meeting what would be the love of his life with no prior dating experience. Of course there's gonna be some awkwardness in that. It also definitely doesn't help that he's acting alongside Natalie Portman in a lot of these scenes, and she just absolutely mogs him. But there are also plenty of scenes where he's not around Padme and is still really awkward, and in those moments, I cannot excuse it. And he certainly isn't helped by just how clunky the dialogue is. Once again, so much of it feels forced, unnatural, and sometimes just bizarre. There's a reason almost every single line from the prequel trilogy has been memed to death. I also was not a huge fan of the characterization of Obi-Wan in this movie. He is such such a helicopter parent. I think this was done on purpose, since part of what pushes Anakin to the dark side is his treatment from the other Jedi. But Obi-Wan is just so much more of an ass than I remember him being, to the point that it made me like his character less, which surprised me. Much like The Phantom Menace, there were also a lot of scenes that just left me with questions that were never answered. For instance, why did each faction of the Separatists become Separatists? I can understand Newt Gunray because the Republic didn't exactly treat him well in Episode 1, even if he was in the wrong, but what's upset the tech unionist? What about the banking clan? I would much rather know the specific reasons these groups joined rather than just knowing they were unhappy with the Republic. Another example of an unanswered question I had was, why are the Geonosians the ones building the Death Star? The Death Star is a pretty major part of the Star Wars universe, in case that wasn't obvious, so I feel like it is kind of important to understand why the Geonosians were willing to help build a planet-killing weapon. I also wish we spent more time getting to know Count Dooku. He is a really interesting character, yet despite being the primary villain of this movie, it feels like he's also kind of a minor character. He has very little screen time, and even the last battle against him felt a little underwhelming. But honestly, other than that, I actually liked a lot of this movie. The plot was a lot easier to follow and felt a lot more well constructed. Even though I've seen this movie before, I was really intrigued by the mystery surrounding the clones and those who built them on Kamino. I also think having two mostly separate storylines helped a lot as well, as it gave viewers more to care about. Plus, if you're not a fan of one of them, maybe you'll like the other. Probably not, but it's not impossible. The visual effects, while still not great, definitely have noticeable improvements from Episode 1, and getting to learn the background of the Fets was cool as well, as was the conflict on Geonosis with all the different Jedi. It was so cool to watch them all pop out of the stands, although after seeing so many iterations of two lines running at each other, this one just felt a bit messy. But it was still cool. And once again, the choreography and soundtrack were pretty stellar as well. While Clone Wars didn't have nearly as many issues as Episode 1, it still wasn't a perfect movie either. More than anything, I think its biggest issue is it's kind of forgettable. Compared to the cultural impact of Episode 1 and Episode 3, the Clone Wars feels a little bit small. And I think that's because it's just kind of meh. It isn't outright bad, but it also still isn't all that good. So I think it's fair to put it in C tier. This brings us to Episode 3. Revenge of the Sith. And man, does this movie slap. From the very first scene, it is just engaging and energetic. I don't even really know where to begin with the positives because there are just so much more than the first two movies. I guess we can start with the relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin. I think it is much improved in this movie. Whereas in Episode 2, Obi-Wan felt like a controlling parent, in Revenge of the Sith, their friendship feels a lot more natural and organic. They are clearly better friends here, but it's still not a perfect friendship, which I like. It makes both characters feel more human and relatable. It's complicated, and I like that. I also feel like the dialogue has seen a notable improvement as well. It's still cheesy, but it's good cheesy now rather than bad cheesy. And once again, the visuals have improved a lot from Episode 2, which was notable from the very first space fight scene. Sure, there are plenty of scenes where they still look pretty dated, but there are also some scenes that look absolutely stellar, which I would hesitate to say about the first two movies. Another major area of improvement is Hayden's acting. While it's not perfect, it is much improved from Episode 2. From the friendly banter he exhibits with Obi-Wan, to the rage he shows as he's burning alive, to the conversations he has with Palpatine, they all feel a lot smoother and in character. There's a reason this is the Anakin everyone remembers, and it's because it just feels so right. I also feel like this movie just has a better plot overall. This was the movie most people were really waiting to see, right? To see how the Republic became the Empire and to see how Anakin became Darth Vader. While that was the point of the entire prequel trilogy, this movie covers a lot of ground and does so very well. No events feel out of place or random. They all make sense, partly because of the foundation set up in the first two movies, as rocky as those movies were. Pretty much everything that was set up pays off here, and in a satisfying manner. The lightsaber fights in this movie are absolutely phenomenal as well. Yoda versus the Emperor, Obi-Wan versus Grievous, this one youngling versus these stormtroopers, and especially Anakin versus Obi-Wan. This is, in my opinion, the best fight of the entire series. Not only are the stakes there, as we've grown to love these two characters over the past 2 movies, and have also watched them grow closer as well, but the choreography was just amazing too. The whole fight is just spectacular, and it works perfectly as the final battle of this trilogy, and the climax of this movie. I also thought Palpatine's rise to power was believable and decently well done. Sure, it could have been more fleshed out than it was, but I don't think it was poorly done in any way, and it feels a lot more realistic after the 2024 US election. An idolatrized figure using an attempt on his life to gain political power and reorganize the government into a more fascist version of itself with the support of many politicians, including the Senate. It seemed a little bit crazy in 2005, but doesn't really now. One specific moment that I really liked was this moment of tenderness from the Emperor when Vader was being assembled. It's the one moment we really see him as anything but an evil overlord post-deformation, and it really stood out to me. The Order 66 sequence was also pretty good. I think it could have been more effective if we had known the Jedi more. Like if Mundi and the others had played a slightly larger role in the first 2 movies, I think these deaths would have been a lot more impactful. I'm sure people who have watched the Clone Wars TV shows find this sequence to be more impactful, but even without watching that series all the way through, I still thought it was a sad sequence overall. That's just part of the power of Williams. The man can make a soundtrack that makes you care about deaths of characters you don't even know. Another small moment I kind of liked was when they wiped C-3PO's memory at the end of the movie. It's just funny how it was done from a seemingly offhand comment, and closed up a major plot hole at the same time. In fact, I kind of liked how the entire ending was just closing up plot holes last minute. Does it show that the prequels had some issues with pacing and how they spent their screen time? Yes it does. But I also low-key love an info dump, so I didn't mind all that much. But there were a few things I did mind, mainly Padme dying of a broken heart. While this can happen in real life, it feels like such a cop-out. I understand they were in a bit of a weird position, because she had to die after she gave birth but couldn't live long enough to do anything significant after Anakin's turn. But like, a broken heart was the best you could do? You couldn't have even said complications from childbirth or something? Like, there had to be ways you could kill her without just being like, yup, she's dead. I also feel a bit weird about General Grievous. As cool as I think the coughing robot is, his inclusion just feels a bit bizarre to me. He's introduced like the new major villain, but barely makes it halfway through the movie. Honestly, he felt more like an afterthought than anything else. I also wish they touched more on the forming of the Resistance. It's vaguely hinted and mentioned at by Bail Organa, but that's pretty much it. I know there's a deleted scene where this is remedied, but it wasn't in the movie, so I can't exactly take it into account. The Resistance was such a huge part of the original trilogy, obviously, so to spend so little time on it in this movie was just a bit disappointing. Overall though, I really enjoyed this movie, and these issues aren't big enough to really detract from the overall experience. I spent a good amount of time debating whether to put this movie in A tier or S tier, but ultimately decided on S tier because the highs are just so high. Now we have 2 standalone movies, the first of which is Solo. This movie is okay. It's not bad from a plot perspective, but like, it's just so forgettable. I wrote down just 3 notes for this movie, and genuinely, I cannot remember anything else about it. Those notes were as follows. The Imperial guy giving Han his last name was dumb. Just let the guy have a last name. The blue lighting at the beginning of the movie did not have the desired effect. It just made it harder to tell what was going on. And finally, the train sequence was pretty cool. Aside from that, the movie was wholly unremarkable. One issue it had though is it lacked tension. We already knew both Han and Chewie would survive the movie, so it didn't feel like there was any stakes in any situation they got in. While this movie wasn't horrendous, it also didn't stand out in any way, shape, or form. As such, I'm going to put it C tier. Next is Rogue One. This movie is not just a great Star Wars movie, but also just a great movie in general. It is a great change from the prequel trilogy. As much as I love the prequels, changing to a more modern movie with better visual effects, cool practical effects, and an entirely new cast is really refreshing. It's nice to have a movie that doesn't center on a Skywalker and where the Force plays a fairly minimal role. All the new characters introduced are interesting, and not a single one is annoying or a dread to see on screen. Rogue One had an incredibly hard task on its hands from the very first scene, and that was making us care about these 5 or 6 characters within a 2.5-hour movie. It's not easy to thoroughly construct a whole cast from scratch like this. I'm reminded of Marvel's Eternals and how it struggled with this issue because it introduced like 11 new characters characters to the audience at once. Rogue One does not struggle with this. Every single character somehow feels like a whole person while also being simple enough to understand. Obviously, some characters like Jyn and Krennic have a bit more depth, but I think that just makes those characters more enjoyable to watch. Plus, I just love the found family trope. Watching this ragtag group of misfits come together to become some of the most important people in the Skywalker saga was both heartwarming and heart-wrenching, as they all died one by one at the end of the movie. This was another advantage of having a completely original cast. Usually in a movie, you can't kill off your main character, main villain, secondary protagonist, and literally every other named character in the movie. But they could here, and I think it really helped to emphasize just how close this mission was to failing. So from a plot and character perspective, this movie really excels. It also excels in the way it constructs its battles. Battle structure is not an aspect of media making that many people consider. So many people will gladly watch two straight lines running at each other and fully enjoy it, and that's fine. I'm not saying this battle structure is outright bad, but personally, I love a battle with multiple important perspectives. Battles like these feel less individualistic and more intricate, which can make them more engaging as well. Rogue One has a great multi-perspective battle in its final fight on Scarif, as we have Jyn's perspective, the beach battle perspective, and the rebels in space. All three are essential to accomplishing the goal at hand, and all three showcase their respective parties in a spectacular way. I know I've focused a lot on this final fight between talking about the deaths and the battle structure, but the rest of the movie is great too. One moment that really stood out to me was when Krennic killed all of Urso's men after he tried to give himself up as the spy. I think it is a good moment, not only to show the cruelty and oppression that existed within the Empire, but also to develop Connolly as a villain as well. I also really liked seeing the Death Star get more use. Between the blasts on Jedha and Scarif, it was just nice to see. I also liked a lot of the space cinematography. So many shots of ships and planets were so cool in this movie in a way that I don't think any other Star Wars movies really capture, and if they do, it's only occasional. For instance, this shot of a Star Destroyer is literally my favorite shot of a Star Destroyer in the entire anthology. It's just so stark and pale and feels like a spaceship captured in our own moonlight. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but I think it looks great, and the rest of the movie looks great too. It does not struggle with the poor color grading and lighting that a lot of movies seem to struggle with these days. And I don't think I could talk about this movie without praising Vader's final walkthrough of Leia's ship. It is so cool, yet so terrifying. It really makes Vader feel like a powerful force of evil in a way that even the original trilogy rarely did. In fact, Vader's presence in this movie was just enjoyable overall. It didn't play a huge part in the main story, which was nice, but he was still there, you know? I'm glad he was the only familiar character we got to see in this movie. The movie is overall just so enjoyable and so well constructed in almost every way. But I do have one minor issue with it: the soundtrack. I knew going into this movie the soundtrack of Rogue One wouldn't be as good as the surrounding movies because it simply does not have John Williams as the composer. But the composer they did get felt a bit amateurish. There were a lot of musical figures that felt awkward or overly repetitive, and I think the choices of where to put soundtrack were a little weird too. Sometimes it felt really forced, and sometimes it just felt too empty. But this is a pretty minor issue in the grand scheme of the movie, and the movie is more than good enough to make up for this one flaw. I'm going to give Rogue One an S tier. It is a phenomenal Star Wars movie and a great movie too, and it is my personal favorite movie in the franchise. Is it the best? Well, that's up for debate, but I think it's undoubtedly up there. But of course, it and all the other movies we're going to talk about wouldn't exist without the original trilogy. This is the trilogy that most Star Wars fans consider to be the best, and as much as I do love the prequels, I have to agree. These movies are just so enjoyable. They're so much more fun than I remember them being, and the practical effects used here have aged so much better than the CGI of the prequel trilogy. The overarching story is undoubtedly the best of any trilogy as well. But to better understand why, let's dive in to episode 4, A New Hope, the movie that started it all. As a movie set in a bizarre and unfamiliar world, A New Hope has the difficult task of both developing the galaxy Star Wars is set in and being an interesting movie, and it does both well. Starting the movie primarily with droids and nonverbal characters was a risky choice, but I think it worked really well, as it allowed the audience to just get immersed in the world without having to worry about dialogue at the same time. It's also impressive just how expressive all these guys are without dialogue, especially especially R2. His sass made this intro even more enjoyable. Truly the GOAT. I also really enjoyed the vibe of Tatooine in this movie. There's a lot of natural beauty between the twin suns and the landscapes, and I feel like that was almost completely absent from the prequel trilogy. Maybe this was intentional to show just how rough Anakin's life was and the state of metropolitan Tatooine, but I still liked it regardless. Obi-Wan is back, and man has it been a rough 20 years, but his presence is welcome in the movie, and I like the role he plays as Luke's teacher a lot more than how he acted as Anakin's. It seems he might have learned a bit from his past mistakes. I also liked how this movie is a lot more raw than a lot of the other Star Wars movies. That's not to say it's especially raw, but I don't think there's another Star Wars movie that actually has blood like this or up-close burnt corpses like this, and it instantly creates a unique atmosphere for the movie. While we're on the subject of Tatooine and Mos Eisley, I think we need to talk about the additions made to the 2011 remaster. They are annoying at best and outright awful at worst. Not only do they look bad, but they're also so distracting and completely unnecessary. They are one of the few outright flaws this movie has, which is crazy because they weren't even there to begin with. Looking past that though, there is a ton of life on Mos Eisley, and I think starting on Tatooine was a really good idea. I also thought the dialogue and characters in this movie were really good too. Everything just felt more organic, and the actors and actresses played their characters superbly. It is a rare case of perfect casting. I truly cannot imagine someone else playing Han Solo, Luke, or Leia. Even someone like Tarkin is perfectly cast. It really all came together for this movie. Although I do gotta say, Chewie's eyes kinda scare me. They just look way too human, which I know they are, but that's not the face human eyes usually go in. I was also kind of surprised by Vader's behavior in this movie, but in a good way. I didn't remember him being so petulant. He's a lot more rash and destructive than I remember him being. I didn't dislike it though, it's just not what I remembered from my previous watches. Honestly, if I went from the Chosen One to a dog for the Empire, I'd probably be pretty pissed too. Another standout aspect of this movie was the pacing. It never really felt too slow or too fast. It was just solid all the way through, as was, of course, the soundtrack. I've said it over and over again, but John Williams just knocks it out of the park every time. If there was one thing I didn't really like about this movie, it was the fight choreography. It just felt really dated, and going from the prequels to this was a stark change. This movie is an easy A tier for me. It's just good, and there isn't much else to say about it. So let's move on to what many people believe to be the best Star Wars movie and potentially the best sequel movie ever made, The Empire Strikes Back. This movie is a masterpiece, simply put. Before we get into what really makes this movie special, I want to talk about one of the most refreshing parts of this movie to me, Luke. In my experience watching modern media, it is so rare to find protagonists that are just nice, good people. So many have to have some angst or have to be morally gray. And while this does make them more interesting characters, Luke being primarily a caring dude was really refreshing to me. It was just a nice change of pace. Now, the rest of the movie, absolute fire. I'm struggling to find the words to explain what is good about this movie. The entire product just works so well, and somehow it just gets better and better as the movie goes on. I especially like the new planets introduced in this movie. Hoth might just be an ice-covered planet, but it's still cool. Get it? The way the Rebel base is built into the ice is sick and feels somewhat realistic somehow, even though it's probably not. The abominable snowman and wampas are cool fauna for this environment too, and the fact the dangers of cold play a part in this movie is welcome as well. But what I really like about Hoth is the new vehicles introduced. The snow speeder things have a really cool and unique design, but I'm sorry, the AT-ATs absolutely steal the show. They just look so cool. Are they probably super inefficient as an attack vessel? Yeah, but the rule of cool says that doesn't matter. Dagobah was cool too, even if it was just basically the Florida Everglades. I loved Yoda's house here. It just looks so cozy. And of course, Bespin is sick too. It might be my favorite Star Wars environment, period. The idea of harvesting gas from a gas giant is genius. It somehow feels both fantastical, yet also vaguely realistic, you know? I could totally see humanity trying to do this in a few hundred years or so if we make it that long. It's such a cool idea, and the aesthetic of the islands of Bespin itself are top tier as well, both inside and out. What really makes all of these environments shine especially bright is, of course, the story that takes place within them. I don't want to dive too deep into the story story here because then I'll just end up going beat by beat and talking about everything I loved, which would take a while. Instead, I'll just go over the highlights. The biggest highlight for this movie, and I guess spoiler alert for a 40-year-old movie, was the reveal that Darth Vader is Luke's father. It's one of the greatest twists in film history, unless you know German. The way this was set up and executed worked perfectly, and it kind of completely recontextualizes how we see Vader and his actions throughout this movie. Don't get me wrong, he's still twisted and not okay, but in a way, he's just trying to connect with his son. I also really liked Luke's training with Yoda. This interpretation of Yoda is so much better than the prequel trilogy, not only because the puppet has aged so much better than the CGI, but he's also just so much more interesting here because he's so much funnier. He really feels like the gremlin he looks like. Han getting trapped in carbonite was another good moment. The "I know" was so in character and such a perfect response. I also liked the introduction of Lando as a character too. He's interesting, and it's just nice to see the main cast be expanded on. As always, the soundtrack was stellar, and I also felt like the lightsaber fights were a bit better in this movie in terms of choreography. It is overall a step up from even A New Hope. For me, it is an easy S tier. Everything just works so well, so I don't have much else to say. Which brings us to Return of the Jedi. This movie is solid. I don't think it's quite as good as the first two movies of this trilogy, but it is still really good. There are a few highlights throughout this movie, but by far the biggest is the redemption of Vader. It is the conclusion to a character arc spanning 6 episodes, and it is very well done and all hinges on one of my favorite scenes in all of Star Wars, where Vader and Luke talk on Endor. It's the first time we really see the mask slip for Vader. Not like literally, obviously. I mean that it feels like this is the first time in the original trilogy where it is Anakin talking, not Vader. That "it's too late for me" was such a tender line from an otherwise unemotional beast. Honestly, all of Luke and Vader's interactions in this movie are phenomenal. Each one feels like a father and son talking, and even though there are only 3 moments, they're some of my favorite moments in the movie. It's such a strong relationship, which is surprising considering how little screen time it has had. The Jabba's palace sequence was very cool and interesting to me as well, especially the final conflict on the sand barges, or whatever they're called. The reunion of Leia and Han that took place during this segment was heartwarming too, although it did feel a bit funny to watch these movies back to back because it felt like he was frozen for hours rather than years. Even the short time Luke spent on Dagobah was well done. It's a big lore drop, but it kind of feels like an inside joke because we already know what Obi-Wan is talking about. The new environments in this movie are pretty good too, or I guess I should say environment because the only new one we see is Endor, but it's still a pretty cool environment. The giant trees really do make it feel fantastical and otherworldly, despite the fact that they're the redwoods of California. I also really liked a lot of the transitions in this movie. I haven't talked about the iconic swipe transitions of Star Wars yet, but that's because I love them in every movie they're in. Plus, they don't really contribute to my overall evaluation or rating of the movies, but I wanted to mention them at least once to give credit where credit is due. Now, with all that praise, you might be thinking why I don't think Return of the Jedi is quite as strong as the other 2 movies in the original trilogy, and there are a couple of reasons. First of all, the dialogue. I know I complained a lot about the dialogue in the prequel section, and it's definitely not as bad here as it is there, but it does start to feel pretty repetitive as the movie goes on, especially from Vader and Palpatine. It's just weird enough to stand out and be noticeable. Like, these two say "complete" so often and in the same exact tone that it's just impossible to ignore. I also felt like the time Luke spent on the Death Star was a bit awkward too. He just spent like a third of the movie looking out a window and trying to mog the Emperor. In fact, I think Luke spent more time staring into space contemplatively this movie than he did talking. There are so many moments where he's just staring, and it starts to feel a little bit bizarre. I understand the dude has a lot on his mind, but still. I also felt like there wasn't a ton of character development from any of the main characters. Not Han, not Leia, not Luke, not even Lando. Obviously, Vader had huge character development, but he was pretty much the only one. Another aspect I wasn't a huge fan of was the fight on Endor. It wasn't bad, but I did feel that it was a bit padded, you know? It dragged on a bit. You could have cut 2 or 3 minutes out of this sequence and still gotten the same result. That's not to say every fight has to be purely utilitarian in nature, but when a fight ends up feeling long, you can probably cut some out. Also, it's it's kind of crazy to retcon incest into the movie. Oh, you always knew you two were siblings and you still kissed him? Weird choice, that's all I'm saying. But honestly, those are the only negatives I have. Even with these complaints, the movie was still overall very solid. It had good bones, and it does make for a satisfying conclusion to this trilogy. I'm gonna put it B tier. It's just not quite on the same level as A New Hope, so I don't feel like it should get the rank of A tier. And now we arrive at the sequel trilogy, starting with The Force Awakens, aka A New Hope 2. I know everyone talks about the similarities between The Force Awakens and A New Hope, but that's just because they are so incredibly similar. Like, at times it feels like we're going beat for beat in the story. While this is an issue, it also means the story itself is pretty solid, but it also means it's kind of hard to give this movie any credit for its own success, you know? Like, I can't really give it credit for having a good plot because the plot is not original at all. There were some original aspects of this movie that I did like though, so let's start there. If there is one thing this movie does better than any other Star Wars movie, it is the flying sequences. These were insane, compared to both the other trilogies. Every single one had a ton of energy and was fully engaging. It was one of the few aspects of this movie that had me on the edge of my seat while I was watching it. I also really enjoyed a lot of the new characters introduced, most notably Finn. I think the idea of a stormtrooper, or whatever they're called in this trilogy, breaking free of its conditioning and turning is such a good concept, and the execution is fairly well done too. Obviously, this is a trope that has been done tons of times in media, but seeing it applied to Star Wars in this way for the first time was really interesting. It also helped that the character of Finn was really enjoyable. I'm not exactly sure what it was about this character. Maybe it was Boyega's acting, or maybe it was his bromance with Poe, but I really enjoyed his story over the course of this movie. Rey was also good. Not quite as good, but not bad. My main issue with Rey is that despite being the new Central Force user, she feels pretty one-dimensional and kind of underdeveloped. This is probably because a lot of her character growth comes from these silent stare-downs, which we are going to talk about in a little bit. I also found the way that she fangirled over the characters from the original movies to be a bit annoying. It felt like she was supposed to be a conduit for the fans in the audience, but in reality she ended up just coming off as that one soy jack. Really, the only character I actively did not like was Kylo Ren. At first, I found him to just be uninteresting, but as the movie went on, I found myself actively disliking him more and more. He's literally just an angrier Darth Vader with a stupider mask. I hate this mask. It looks so ugly and it is so boring. There's no personality or distinguishing features, just a bald little head with a giant nose. It might actually be my least favorite mask in all of Star Wars. I just hate it so much. Although wearing a mask like this is actually a pretty cool way to self-nerf, because without it, Adam Driver looks so good he would be distracting to his opponents. With all that being said, I do have a decent bit of criticism for this movie too, which is the treatment of R2-D2. R2 is an icon of Star Wars, dare I say one of the most recognizable and beloved characters in the movies, up there with the likes of Vader, Obi-Wan, and Luke. Okay, maybe not that high, but he's still highly regarded, and they put him in a coma for 90% of the movie, only to wake up at the perfect moment to act as a plot device? The audacity. And for what reason? To give BB-8 more screen time to sell more plushes? To just take him out of the story because he's too goated with it? It is such a stupid decision to omit R2 from this movie, especially since you don't even have to include him that heavily. You could just use him for the occasional comic relief, and that's it. The little dude is such an easy character to include, and they just didn't for no good reason. Also, you're telling me this droid went 19 years without Anakin, no problem, but when Luke disappears, he's down for the count in like 4? Like, I get that he's getting up there in years, but still, that's not like him. I also didn't like just how easily Rey picked up the Force. This also isn't a huge deal, but when you compare her progress to the Force in this movie to Luke's progress in A New Hope, while he had a teacher, it's just not realistic to me that she could do what she did. But it's not like Star Wars is the most realistic story anyway. And I know this was probably done for the sake of storytelling, as it's a lot easier to develop a story of a movie if you're not worrying about the asymmetric power between the main character and antagonist. But from a world-building perspective, it just feels kind of absurd. She got to a similar level of strength as Kylo with no training, just weird Force stare-downs. These are another thing I didn't really like about this movie. These Force stare-downs just feel so lazily done. It's just jump cuts between two pairs of eyes over and over again. What's going on in their heads? Like, you couldn't have added some visuals to show how this worked? We just have to sit here and watch these two characters stare at each other and pretend we know what's going on in there? Literally just two faces wiggling their eyebrows at each other? Even with my complaints though, I don't think it's an awful movie. It is a slightly worse version of A New Hope, but it's not like atrociously bad or anything, so I want to put it in B tier. Next is the penultimate movie, The Last Jedi. And I gotta be honest, I think this is the most over-hated movie in all of Star Wars. Don't get me wrong, it's still a bad movie, but people talk about it like it killed their grandmas and ruined Star Wars as a concept when I just don't think that's the case. I think a lot of the complaints are overall overblown. Like the people who say the casino sequence was pointless and too time consuming. It was like 15 minutes total and I didn't mind it. I felt like the light commentary about war profiteering was welcome, as it was a topic that hadn't really been covered in the series up to this point despite the entirety of the series revolving around war. I can understand the people that felt like Finn was being sidelined by being stuck in this sequence, and that is a valid criticism. I would have liked him to have a more major role as well, but I don't think it's as bad as people say it was. Same goes for Rose, who does not deserve the hate she gets. Was I annoyed when she stopped Finn's self-sacrifice scene? Yeah, that was dumb as hell. Do I think her fake-out death was weird too? Yup, but I don't think the character itself is all that bad. I find her presence in the movie to be overall enjoyable. With that being said, I do have a number of criticisms for this movie. My first being Luke. From a storytelling standpoint, I understand why they turned Luke into this ornery old man. In order for a sequel trilogy to happen while Luke is alive, he pretty much needs to be a failure in some capacity. It doesn't really work if he's a full power, full strength Jedi, because it skews the power dynamic and makes every conflict centered on Luke, which I don't think Disney wanted to do. They wanted to inject some new life into the series. So I kind of understand why Luke is the way that he is, but man, is it a character assassination. It's crazy to go from the Luke of episode 6 who saw the good in Darth Vader to the Luke of episode 8 who Loki considered killing a Padawan for the darkness in him. It just feels so out of character, as does him being so unfriendly and unaccommodating. He's also a lot more rash than Luke was in the original trilogy. Obviously, Luke did not always have the most sound judgment back then, but he also didn't try to burn the ancient Jedi texts because he was frustrated with them. I also was not a huge fan of how the death of Snoke was handled. It is a plot twist, but the twist is not all that well done. It feels very abrupt and calls into question why Snoke was even a character in the first place. The dude was ultimately so insignificant to the story. Poe also kind of pissed me off in this movie. I know he acted the way he did because he thought it was for the best, but like, dude, have a smidge of trust in your leaders, you know? Like, did you really think they were doing nothing just because they don't tell you what their plan is? So childish. Also, not that important, but who on Earth, or I guess Yavin 4, thought it was a good idea to design a bomber this way? They have to be some of the worst designed spacecraft I've seen in Star Wars, not just visually but also functionally. Then there's of course Leia's Force moment, which just felt a bit weird. It's not unbelievable that Leia would be able to use the Force in some manner, like this, but the way it was revealed and executed was just laughable. This girl was in the cold of space with zero air for like a minute, and she came back easy peasy. Also, if she is this competent with the Force, why didn't she ever use it in episode 7? Is it maybe because there was no congruent plan for this trilogy when they set out to make it? I have no clue. This is also the movie where the speed that Rey learns the Force starts to become an issue. I can accept her being above average with it due to her heritage, as we learn later, but like, it took Anakin, the Chosen One, supposedly one of the strongest Force users ever, a decade to get to the point of pushing droids around, and we're supposed to accept that Rey can lift all these rocks with like a week of training? It just completely delegitimizes every single Jedi from the past, and kind of turns the Force into a toy, but more on that later. With all that being said, there were a few things I did like about this movie. I really liked the theme of letting the past die. I think it makes a lot of sense in a movie like this that was constantly being compared to its 7 previous predecessors. You have to find some way to separate this movie and the trilogy as a whole from the past. I also really liked what it did for Kylo Ren's character, as it allowed him to move past Vader and become a much more interesting and compelling villain by the end of the movie. Surely that won't be reversed in The Rise of Skywalker. I also liked a lot of the visuals in this movie too. Obviously the lightspeed strike was sick as hell, but even the environments like Snoke's room and the evil glory hole from Luke's island were cool too. I also really liked how Rey and Kylo Ren's relationship evolved over this movie. Were the Force FaceTimes a bit dumb? Yeah, but they created an interesting dynamic between these two that wasn't as clear as good and evil. It almost felt like they were setting up for these two to trade places in this movie or the next, which I thought was a really intriguing concept. Obviously, that didn't really come to fruition, as we'll talk about soon. I also thought the lightsaber fights were pretty decent in this movie. I liked when Kylo Ren and Rey teamed up against the Red Guards, and then the conflict between Luke and Kylo was cool too, even if Luke wasn't really there. To me, this movie is C tier. While it had a lot of good ideas, the execution in a lot of scenes didn't really embolden these ideas, and with the number of issues that existed individually of these good ideas, I just cannot justify putting it any higher. And now we come to the true abomination. The Rise of Skywalker is truly an insane movie. Not only is the plot insane, but the fact this movie got approved and released is also insane. I have tried to be nice in my approach to many of the Star Wars movies up to this point, but I genuinely do not think I can do that for this movie because it was so bad. It had me rolling my eyes in annoyance more than a family fight at Thanksgiving. The biggest and most obvious issue with this movie is, of course, its villain. Palpatine somehow returned. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you how stupid of an idea this is, but it's a really stupid idea. Not only does it undermine the redemption of Vader, which is a huge issue itself, but it's also stupid because literally everyone who has seen Return of the Jedi watched him plummet 1,000 feet into what appears to be a nuclear reactor of the Death Star, which then violently exploded like 3 minutes later. It is like the least ambiguous death possible, and yet the best explanation they came up with was somehow. That was the best Disney's writers could do. Could you imagine pulling this in any other professional environment? Somehow I deleted our entire client database. Somehow the person in my ambulance died. You'd probably get fired, or at least reprimanded greatly. And yet this line from one of the most expensive films ever made was approved. Almost $500 million went into this film, and the best they could come up with was somehow. Another major complaint people had with this movie was the knife moment, which is terrible, but I just could not get myself to care about it at that point in the movie. Too much other dumb shit happened that I just rolled my eyes and moved on. The biggest overarching issue in this movie for me personally was just how convenient the entire plot seemed to be. Yes, the aforementioned knife and somehow moments are both plot conveniences, but there are so many more that happened so frequently that it just pissed me off. The Sith Wayfinder surviving this fire? How convenient. The Star Destroyer shields don't work until they're out of the atmosphere? How convenient. Kylo Ren finding a TIE fighter in usable condition in the ruins of the Death Star? Not unbelievable, but very convenient. R2-D2 having a way to restore 3CPO's memory? Goated as usual, but convenient. Oh, and he can also track Luke's ship from light years away, a super useful ability that has never been showcased before? How convenient. I can accept when the plot is convenient a couple of times in a movie. It's gonna happen. Not everything has to be perfectly calculated, but this movie just has way too many. Should have called this movie Star Wars: The Rise of 7-Eleven with how convenient it is. While we're on the topic of R2-D2, I just have to express how much it annoyed me that they sidelined my goat for this stupid, annoying, clumsy green little robot. In fact, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I don't like how the sequels in general treat R2. Instead of a sassy, funny, lovable droid with a lot of personality and importance, he basically became a plot device that could just fix whatever issue they had at the time and then disappear for the rest of the movie. How are you gonna do the goat like that? His treatment is actually not unlike the treatment of the Force in this movie as well. And by that, I mean that it just becomes too much of a plot device. Don't get me wrong, the Force has always been a plot device, but it has never felt so much like a plot device as it does in The Rise of Skywalker. It just feels like a tool that can do whatever they want it to do. It's like they tried to use the rule of cool, but completely failed, like when they teleported a lightsaber through the Force. This is such a useful Force ability, and the fact that these two are the first people we see using it is crazy. You're really telling me that no Jedi Master in the Republic could do this, but Rey and Kylo could? Really? Or Or how about when Rey did this and it actually just killed the Emperor? Like, what even was this? Also, not that important, but who are all these people? Why does Palpatine have an entire stadium in his basement filled with aliens that are barely acknowledged? While we're talking about this sequence, I should also mention that Kylo Ren's death was pretty stupid. The dude died literally 3 seconds after kissing Rey. I had to take a break after this moment because it was just the straw that broke the camel's back. You know how earlier I said I stopped caring about the movie's issues by the time the knife came around because there were just so many? Well, that was a lie. I tried not to care about all the stupid stuff that happened in this movie, but there was just so much that I did start caring again and just got more and more frustrated as the movie went on, culminating at this exact moment. The offenses of this movie left me scarred and deformed. While I could go through everyone and pick it apart like an English teacher picks apart that one essay you actually tried on, I'm not going to because I don't want this video to be 4 hours long. So I'm going to touch on 4 more things that I didn't like about this movie and then move on. Number 1, the humor. It just feels so dated. I bet these jokes hit so good in 2019 when this movie came out, but in 2025, it's just not enjoyable. Almost every joke in this movie made me sigh or, once again, roll my eyes. They just didn't land for me at all, and some of them were so bad they completely took me out of the moment. 2, Leia is a fully trained Jedi? I don't mind this plot point in theory. I think Leia being a Jedi is a pretty cool idea, but like, why wait until the last half of the final movie in the trilogy to bring it up? It would have been really nice if we had this information before she magnetized to the door from outer space. Also, if she is a fully realized Jedi, then why was it so important for Rey to train with Luke? I can understand the importance in finding Luke in the first movie, but she could have just dropped off his lightsaber and then went to train with Leia, who seems mighty competent with the Force herself. 3, the new Star Destroyers have planet killers. It's crazy that in a matter of years, we went from needing a moon-sized battle station to destroy a planet, to needing a star to destroy multiple, to every single Star Destroyer in this fleet being able to destroy a planet individually. How did the technology progress this fast from 7 to 9? Was Palpatine just hiding them this whole time? 4, the ending in general. From Rey randomly having a new lightsaber that is never explained, to her just deciding to take the Skywalker name for no reason. It just felt completely arbitrary, unfinished, and unsatisfying. There is still so much more wrong with this movie, like the treatment of Finn as a character and also Rose as a character, or the spy. Don't get me started on the spy, or how the final climax was just so underwhelming. But I've already talked about this movie for longer than I have any other, and it's been all negative, so I want to give it one single positive note before we leave. I really liked that they included Hayden in this moment with Rey. It was nice to hear his voice after he had been completely absent from the trilogy, although it did also annoy me a little bit, because it made me wonder why Anakin never approached Kylo Ren as a Force ghost. Like, the dude has idolized Darth Vader and is Anakin's grandson, but he never thought it would be a good idea to be like, yo, so you're actually on a pretty bad path, and I would not recommend. Like, that would have been so cool and probably would have fixed at least 50% of Kylo Ren's problems, but I'm not gonna go back to being negative. Another positive for me was the environment of the crashed Death Star. How this much remained of it after it exploded is unknown to me, but the setting was cool and eerie. The rest of the new planets kind of sucked though, if I'm being honest. Like, Selgor was just dark and flat with one big ass square. Talk about uninspired. I think a part of why I do not like Excalibur that much is because Dune 2 did Gady Prime so well. I know the two aren't related in any way, but it was the first thing I thought of when I saw Elsagor, and I thought it was a much better interpretation of a planet that houses cruel and industrial evil, making Axolotl seem really lame by comparison. This movie is our F tier. I genuinely think anyone that has seen the other 8 main Star Wars movies could make a better movie than this. There is nothing that could be done to save this movie from being bad. It is truly irredeemable. You would need to restart from the ground up to try and get something better, and I don't think it would be hard to do that. Anyway, I have talked about Star Wars for way longer than I originally anticipated, so I'm gonna sign off here. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. It really does mean a lot to me, and if you're not already, maybe consider subscribing. You obviously like the content. Thank you so much once again, and I'll see you soon for our next video.